November 14th, 1957. Apalachin, New York. A small town in the southern tier near the Pennsylvania border. Population under 1,000. Nothing here except a paper mill and a river, and the kind of quiet that small American towns have on a Thursday afternoon in November, when the leaves are down and the sky is gray, and nothing of consequence has ever happened here before. At the large stone mansion owned by Joseph Barbara, a local businessman who runs a Canada Dry distributorship and is known in the area as a generous employer and occasional civic benefactor, something unprecedented is happening. Cars are arriving from every direction. Cadillacs and Lincolns and Chryslers, the specific American luxury automobiles of 1957, coming up the long driveway in groups. Men in expensive suits getting out. Men whose names, if you recognized them, would tell you that something extraordinary is taking place in this unremarkable upstate New York town on this gray November afternoon. The names? Vito Genovese, boss of the Genovese family. Carlo Gambino, boss of the Gambino family. Joe Bonanno, boss of the Bonanno family. Tommy Lucchese, boss of the Lucchese family. Paul Castellano, Tony Accardo, Sam Giancana, Santos Trafficante, Carlos Marcello. The heads of the most powerful organized crime families in America, gathered in one place at one time for the kind of meeting that the syndicate holds only when the business to be discussed is too significant for any other forum. Over 100 men will eventually be identified as having attended or attempted to attend this meeting. The names read like a complete roster of American organized crime leadership in 1957. Almost every major figure in the syndicate is here or on their way here. Almost every major figure. And then, at 12:40 in the afternoon, New York State Police Sergeant Edgar Crosswell, who has had the Barbara estate under surveillance for months because of his suspicions about Barbara's organized crime connections, calls for backup and begins setting up roadblocks on the roads leading to the property. What follows is the single greatest law enforcement action against American organized crime in the country's history to that point. Men in expensive suits run through the woods in November. They abandon their cars. They trip in the underbrush. They are found hiding behind trees and in ditches by state troopers who cannot quite believe what they are apprehending. 63 men are eventually detained. Their names are taken. The press photographs them being escorted by state police. The images go national. The meeting that organized crime had held for decades with the assumption of absolute secrecy has been exposed on the front pages of every newspaper in America. The political consequences are immediate and lasting. J. Edgar Hoover, who had been insisting for decades that no national organized crime syndicate existed in America, is publicly humiliated. The congressional hearings that follow produce the first major federal legislation specifically targeting organized crime. The FBI reorganizes its priorities. The Attorney General's office begins building the cases that will eventually become the most significant federal prosecutions of organized crime in American history. Apalachin changes everything. It is the day that the existence of the American Organized Crime Syndicate is proven beyond any official denial. The day that the invisible becomes visible in a way that cannot be managed or suppressed. Now consider the complete list of who was there. Consider it carefully. Consider every major figure in the syndicate who attended, tried to attend, or was identified in connection with the meeting. Consider the specific geography of the syndicate's leadership at that moment, and think about which names you expect to see and which names are missing. Meyer Lansky was not at Apalachin. He was not there. He was not apprehended. He was not identified in connection with the meeting. He was not photographed by state police. He did not run through the woods in an expensive suit. His name does not appear on the list of men detained or questioned at Apalachin. The man who was more central to the financial operations of the syndicate than any other single individual, The financial architect of the entire organization was not at the most important organizational meeting of the decade. The question is why? There are several possible explanations. The simplest is that Meyer Lansky was not invited, that the meeting was primarily an Italian-American affair, organized by and for the Italian families, and that his non-Italian background meant he was not included in the guest list, even for a meeting of this significance. This explanation has some merit as a partial account, but fails as a complete one. Meyer Lansky's relationship with the major Italian family bosses who attended Apalachin was documented and extensive. His financial services were indispensable to most of them. The idea that he would be excluded from a meeting of this organizational significance on ethnic grounds contradicts the documented reality of his position in the syndicate. The second explanation is that he knew the meeting was being surveilled and chose not to attend for that reason. This explanation is the one that has been most seriously considered by investigators and historians who have studied the Apalachin meeting. The specific question it raises is, how did he know? How did Meyer Lansky, if this explanation is correct, learn about a law enforcement surveillance operation that the state police themselves kept secret until the moment of the raid? The answer to that question is the most interesting part of the Apalachin story. Not the raid itself, which is dramatic and well documented. The absence. The specific intelligence that allowed one man to not be there while everyone else was. Meyer Lansky's intelligence operation has been described in various accounts of his career as among the most sophisticated in the organized crime world. It was not a formal organization. It was a network of relationships. Relationships with people who were in positions that gave them access to information that was valuable. Retired law enforcement officials who maintained contact with their former colleagues and who heard things that circulated through the law enforcement community. Lawyers who worked both sides of the line and who picked up specific information through their professional contacts. Political figures who were kept informed of law enforcement priorities and who, through various intermediary arrangements, passed that information along. The specific information about Apalachin, if Meyer Lansky received it, would have come through exactly this kind of network. Sergeant Croswell's surveillance of the Barbara estate was not entirely secret. He had been building his file on Barbara for months. He had made inquiries. He had spoken to colleagues. In the specific world of upstate New York law enforcement in 1957, the fact that a state police sergeant was watching a property in Apalachin because he suspected organized crime connections was not a piece of information that existed in complete isolation. It existed in a network of institutional knowledge that could be accessed by someone with the right relationships. Meyer Lansky had the right relationships. He had spent 30 years cultivating exactly the kind of institutional connections that could provide advance warning of law enforcement activities. The specific information that Croswell was watching Barbara's estate, that something significant was being planned there, that attendance at a meeting there on a specific date carried significant risk, was the kind of information that his network was designed to produce, and that he was positioned to receive. If he received it, he acted on it in the most characteristic way possible. He stayed home. No drama, no warning to others, no visible indication that anything unusual had happened. He simply did not attend a meeting that every other major figure in the syndicate attended, and when those figures emerged from the woods of Apalachin into the flashbulbs of the state police cameras, he was in Miami Beach or in New York, eating at his regular restaurant, doing the things a retired-looking accountant does on a November Thursday. The aftermath of Apalachin is instructive about what his absence meant for his subsequent position. The men who were caught at Apalachin faced a wave of investigations and prosecutions. Their attendance at the meeting was documented. It was used in subsequent legal proceedings as evidence of their organizational membership. The public exposure of their identities and their presence at the meeting made every subsequent law enforcement action against them more politically viable. The cameras that photographed them at Apalachin created a public record that made it harder for prosecutors to let organized crime cases drop. Meyer Lansky had no such record. He was not at Apalachin. His name did not appear in the newspaper accounts of the meeting. His face was not in the photographs. While the leaders of the syndicate were managing the legal and political consequences of their Apalachin exposure, Meyer Lansky was continuing to operate without the specific additional vulnerability that the exposure created. His position was unchanged. His profile was unchanged. His relationship with law enforcement was unchanged. He was exactly as invisible after Apalachin as he had been before it. This is the specific benefit of the absence. Not just the immediate legal benefit of not being present when police arrive. The ongoing benefit of not having been publicly identified as a syndicate leader at the moment when the existence of the syndicate was being publicly proven. The other bosses who were photographed at Apalachin could no longer claim to be legitimate businessmen whose organized crime associations were the fantasies of investigators. The meeting had proven the syndicate existed. Their presence had proven their membership. The public proof was in the newspapers. Meyer Lansky remained outside that proof. The financial architect of the entire organization that the Apalachin meeting had just proven existed remained unconnected, publicly and photographically, to that proof. The FBI's file on him continued to accumulate. The investigators who had been building cases continued their work. But the specific legal and political benefit that Apalachin provided for prosecutions of the bosses who attended did not apply to him. He had not been there. The men who ran through the woods that day faced years of intensified scrutiny and a changed legal landscape that eventually produced the prosecutions of the 1960s and 1970s. Meyer Lansky faced the same investigators and the same legal landscape, without the specific additional disadvantage of Apalachin attendance. In a world where advantages are measured in inches and disadvantages accumulate into convictions, this specific absence from a specific meeting on a specific afternoon in November 1957 was an advantage that compounded for years. This is what intelligence means in practice. Not dramatic espionage, not elaborate information networks. The specific knowledge, obtained through carefully maintained relationships with people in positions to have it, that this meeting, on this day, in this location, was a meeting he should not attend. The translation of that knowledge into the simple act of not showing up, and the recognition that not showing up is sometimes the most consequential action available. The other bosses at Apalachin did not make this translation. They received their invitations to what was presented as an important organizational meeting, and they attended. The meeting was important. Their attendance was understandable, given the organizational pressures that made non-attendance politically complicated. Being invited to a meeting of this significance and choosing not to attend without a credible reason carried its own organizational risks. The bosses who came to Apalachin made the rational organizational decision. They could not have known, without the specific intelligence that Meyer Lansky apparently had, that the decision to attend would turn out so badly. This is the specific advantage that intelligence provides over ordinary organizational membership. The person with the intelligence makes decisions with more information than the person without it. The better-informed decision is not always the safer-looking decision at the time. Not attending a major organizational meeting when everyone else is attending is a decision that requires justification. Meyer Lansky's justification, whatever it was or whether any justification was required, was invisible to everyone who mattered. He simply was not there. The reason was his business. The result was the photographs of everyone else being led through the woods in expensive suits. He was at home, doing what he did, running the financial architecture of an organization that had just been publicly proven to exist, and publicly proven to include almost everyone except him. The invisible man, once again invisible at the moment when everyone around him became visible, not by accident, by the specific application of the intelligence that had kept him alive and free and operational for 30 years and would continue to keep him that way for another 25. If this story of the most consequential absence in American organized crime history, of the man who was the most important person, not in the most important photograph, moved you, subscribe to this channel. Because the full story of how Meyer Lansky survived everything that came after Apalachin, while the men in the photographs did not, is the story of everything we have talked about in this series. The invisibility, the intelligence network, the financial architecture, the patience, the absence of ego, the decision to not be seen. Drop a comment. Tell me what you think Meyer Lansky was doing on November 14, 1957, while his colleagues were running through the woods. And remember this: sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply not show up. Meyer Lansky understood this better than anyone. He proved it on a November afternoon in upstate New York, while 63 other men proved the opposite. To fully appreciate what Meyer Lansky's absence from Apalachin represented, you have to understand what Apalachin represented for the history of American organized crime. The meeting was not an accident. It was not an informal gathering. It was the National Crime Syndicate's governing commission in plenary session, called for specific business that required the presence of the major family bosses from across the country. The business at the meeting was the resolution of the conflict that had been destabilizing the syndicate for the previous year. Vito Genovese had ordered the assassination of Frank Costello's associate Albert Anastasia in October 1957, 6 weeks before the Apalachin meeting. The murder of Anastasia, shot in a barber shop on Park Avenue, was a power move of the most aggressive kind. Genovese was trying to consolidate his position as the dominant boss in New York and nationally. The commission had been called to legitimize Genovese's position and to resolve the territorial consequences of the Anastasia killing. This was exactly the kind of meeting that Meyer Lansky would normally have been closely involved with, at least from the financial side. The territorial reshuffling that followed a major power transition had financial implications that required his involvement. The management of the operations that Anastasia had controlled, the redistribution of revenue streams, the adjustment of the financial architecture to reflect the new organizational structure, all of this was his domain. His absence from the meeting that was supposed to settle these questions was not organizationally neutral. It was notable, and yet he was not there. He had received some information through some channel that being there was something he should not do, and he translated that information into absence without leaving any visible trace of how he obtained it or why he acted on it. The question of how he knew has never been definitively answered. Several theories have been advanced over the decades since the meeting. The one most consistently supported by the available evidence is the informant theory, that Meyer Lansky had, through the network of relationships he had been cultivating for decades, received word that law enforcement had the Barbara estate under surveillance. Not necessarily from a law enforcement officer directly, possibly from a lawyer who had heard something from a client who had a reason to know. Possibly from a political contact who had access to information about state police activities. Possibly from someone within Barbara's household or business circle who noticed the surveillance without understanding its significance. The specific source has never been established. The general mechanism is consistent with how Meyer Lansky's intelligence network is known to have operated throughout his career. There is a second theory that deserves examination. It is the theory that Meyer Lansky was not invited because his position in the syndicate had evolved in a way that made his formal attendance at commission meetings less necessary. By 1957, he had spent 25 years as the syndicate's financial architect. His position was so established, so acknowledged, so embedded in the organizational structure, that he no longer needed to attend formal meetings to exercise his influence. He could do what he needed to do from a position of standing that did not require physical presence at specific locations. This theory has some appeal. It is consistent with the general principle that the most powerful positions in the syndicate were not necessarily the most visible ones. And it is consistent with the specific pattern of Meyer Lansky's career, which was built on the principle that invisibility was preferable to visibility, and that influence exercised through relationships was more durable than influence exercised through formal organizational positions. But even if this theory is correct, it does not fully account for the specific timing of the Apalachin meeting. The business being conducted at Apalachin was precisely the kind of business that required Meyer Lansky's financial intelligence. The territorial reshuffling, the revenue allocation, the structural adjustments to the organization following the Anastasia killing, all of these required his specific expertise. A meeting to discuss these matters without him present was either a meeting that would need his input later, which he would then provide in a less visible form, or a meeting from which he was specifically excluded, which raises the question of why. The most parsimonious explanation combines elements of both theories. Meyer Lansky had advanced intelligence about the surveillance of the Barber estate and used that intelligence to avoid attendance at a meeting that his organizational position might otherwise have led him to attend. The intelligence did not come to him in dramatic form. It came through the ordinary functioning of the network of relationships he maintained, which was designed to provide exactly this kind of early warning. He received it. He acted on it. The action was simple. He did not go to Apalachin. The men who were photographed in the woods that day were not stupid. They were not incautious men. They were the leaders of the most powerful criminal organization in America, and they had survived and thrived in that position by being very careful about their own security. The fact that they attended a meeting that ended in their being publicly photographed and detained by state police was not a reflection of carelessness. It was a reflection of not having the specific piece of intelligence that would have told them the meeting was compromised. Meyer Lansky had that piece of intelligence. They did not. The difference between having it and not having it is the difference between being in the photographs and not being in the photographs. And the difference between being in the photographs and not being in the photographs is, in the specific context of 1957 and what came after 1957, not a small difference. It is the difference between the wave of prosecutions that followed Apalachin and continuing to operate without the specific additional legal vulnerability that Apalachin attendance created. He continued to operate. The others managed their Apalachin exposure for years. Carlo Gambino, who was photographed at Apalachin, spent years managing the legal consequences while rising to become the most powerful family boss in America. He survived Apalachin and thrived after it, which is a testament to his own considerable capabilities. But he managed from a position that included the specific legal and political disadvantage of documented Apalachin attendance. Meyer Lansky managed from a position without that disadvantage. The operational implications of not having been at Apalachin showed immediately in the post-meeting period. The Kefauver Committee had already documented the syndicate's existence in 1950 and 1951. Apalachin proved it to anyone who still doubted it, and added 63 faces and names to the publicly documented record. Law enforcement priorities shifted. Congressional attention intensified. The pressure on organized crime operations increased significantly in the years after Apalachin. In this new environment, the people who had not been at Apalachin had an advantage over the people who had. Not immunity. The FBI was building cases against Meyer Lansky before and after Apalachin, regardless of his attendance. But the specific additional legal and political targeting that came with being publicly identified at Apalachin was a disadvantage he did not carry. The investigators who came after him did so without the specific motivation and political support that being photographed at Apalachin generated for the men who were there. The Apalachin escape is the most dramatic illustration of a principle that governed Meyer Lansky's entire career. The principle that the best outcome in a dangerous situation is not surviving the danger after it arrives. It is not being in the position where the danger arrives in the first place. The men at Apalachin survived the state police raid in the immediate sense. They were detained, questioned, and released. No one was convicted of anything on the basis of being at Apalachin alone. But they were in the position where the danger arrived. They dealt with the consequences for years. Meyer Lansky was not in that position. He had information. He used it. He was elsewhere. The danger that arrived in Apalachin on November 14, 1957, arrived for everyone who was there and for no one who was not. Meyer Lansky was not there. The principle, applied once more, produced its standard result. In the weeks after Apalachin, as the newspapers were full of photographs of suited men being led through the woods, and as congressional committees were mobilizing, and as the FBI was reassessing its organized crime strategy, Meyer Lansky was conducting his normal business. The financial architecture was operating. The offshore accounts were current. The casino operations were producing their documented revenues. Everything was normal. Nothing had changed for the financial architect of the syndicate, because the thing that had changed everything for everyone else had not touched him. He had not been there. That was all. He had not been there. And in the specific history of American organized crime, not being there on November 14, 1957, is one of the most consequential acts of absence in the record. The absence that preserved a career. The absence that allowed the financial architecture of the syndicate to continue operating while its visible leadership dealt with the consequences of having been seen. The absence that is itself the full expression of everything Meyer Lansky understood about how power works and how survival works, and how the specific application of good intelligence to a simple decision produces outcomes that no amount of toughness or organizational muscle can produce after the fact. He was not there. The woods of Apalachin do not contain his footprints. The photographs of the raid do not contain his face. The roster of the men who ran from the state police does not contain his name. The most important man who was not at the most important meeting of his era. The invisible man, invisible once more, at exactly the moment when being invisible mattered most. The Apalachin story has an epilogue that reinforces the point. In the years following the raid, investigators and prosecutors made several attempts to use the fact of attendance at the Apalachin meeting as evidence in criminal proceedings. The theory was that participation in a meeting of this kind, with these participants, demonstrated membership in the criminal conspiracy that the meeting represented. If attendance could be proven, and for 63 men it could be, attendance was evidence of syndicate membership. The legal theory was partially successful. Several of the Apalachin attendees were convicted in federal court on charges related to their conspiracy to obstruct justice in their responses to questions about the meeting. The convictions were later overturned on appeal, but the legal proceedings themselves created years of difficulty for the men who had been there. More lastingly, the Apalachin attendance became a factor in every subsequent law enforcement action against the attendees. Prosecutors who might otherwise have faced difficulties establishing the organizational connections of their targets now had documented evidence that their targets had attended a meeting with the leadership of organized crime in America. The documented attendance was not a crime in itself, but it was a fact that could be established and that changed the context of every subsequent proceeding. Meyer Lansky faced none of this. His name was not in the Apalachin meeting records. No prosecutor could establish that he had been there. The specific advantage that non-attendance provided was permanent. Every subsequent investigation and prosecution of syndicate members could use Apalachin attendance as supporting evidence. Meyer Lansky's prosecutors could not. The specific intelligence that allowed this outcome was obtained through the kind of patient, sustained relationship maintenance that Meyer Lansky had been practicing since he was a young man. The network of contacts that produced advance warning of law enforcement activities was not built overnight. It was built over decades through consistent cultivation of relationships with people in positions to have useful information. Each relationship was maintained not for a specific anticipated purpose, but because the category of person represented, law enforcement adjacent, politically connected, legally sophisticated, was the category most likely to produce exactly this kind of early warning when it was needed. The investment in the relationships produced the return. The return, on November 14, 1957, was the knowledge that allowed Meyer Lansky to be somewhere other than Apalachin. The return was the absence. The absence was the survival. The survival was the continuation of a career that would run for another 25 years, while the careers of the men in the photographs from Apalachin were permanently altered. This is the accounting of intelligence. You invest in relationships. You maintain them. You pay attention to what they produce. You act on what they produce when acting on it matters. The return is not always measurable. Sometimes the return is an absence that has no drama, no visible significance, no moment of triumph. Just a man in Miami Beach on a Thursday afternoon who is not in upstate New York, where everyone else is, because he knew that not being there was the right decision. He knew. He stayed home. The woods of Apalachin are not where the real story happened. The real story happened wherever Meyer Lansky was on November 14, 1957, doing whatever ordinary thing he was doing, knowing what was happening elsewhere, and knowing that not being part of it was the most important decision of that year. The man who was not at Apalachin, the absence that changed nothing for him and changed everything for everyone who was there, the intelligence that produced the absence, the relationships that produced the intelligence, the 30 years of patient, consistent, invisible cultivation of exactly the kind of network that produces exactly this kind of result at exactly this kind of moment. That is the Apalachin escape. That is Meyer Lansky. That is how the invisible man stayed invisible at the one moment when being visible cost everyone who was visible more than they ever expected to pay. The woods of Apalachin are quiet now. The photographs are in archives. The men who ran through those woods are long dead. The state police sergeant who set the roadblocks is long dead. The political careers that were built on Apalachin are long finished. And Meyer Lansky, who was not there, is also long dead. But the record of his absence is as permanent as the record of everyone else's presence. He was not there. He was never there. The invisible man, the accountant, the architect, the person who understood better than anyone that the most important part of any dangerous situation is not how you survive it, it is how you arrange to not be in it when it arrives. There is one more dimension to the Apalachin story that deserves its place in the complete account. It is the dimension of what happened inside the syndicate after Apalachin and how Meyer Lansky's absence from the meeting affected his position within the organization in the months and years that followed. The men who attended Apalachin came home from upstate New York to a world that had changed. Their public exposure created immediate practical problems. Law enforcement surveillance of their activities intensified. Their political connections became liabilities rather than assets, as politicians scrambled to distance themselves from newly famous organized crime figures. Their ability to operate with the freedom they had previously enjoyed was substantially reduced. The specific ambient protection that comes from not being publicly identified was gone for all of them. Meyer Lansky came home from wherever he was on November 14th to no such change. The world he operated in was exactly the same on November 15th as it had been on November 13th. His surveillance profile was unchanged. His political connections were unchanged. His financial operations were unchanged. The Apalachin raid had not touched his world in any direct way because he had not been at Apalachin. What this meant for his organizational position was complex. On one hand, his absence could be seen as a sign of reduced organizational standing. The most important meeting of the decade had been called, and the financial architect of the syndicate had not attended. This could be interpreted, by people who wanted to interpret it that way, as evidence that his position was less central than it appeared. On the other hand, his absence could be seen as evidence of superior intelligence and superior judgment. While everyone else had walked into a trap, Meyer Lansky had seen the trap coming and stayed away from it. This interpretation would have been apparent to anyone who thought carefully about the situation. The man who was not at Apalachin was either less important than everyone thought, or smarter than everyone there. Given what was known about his role in the organization, the second interpretation was the more credible one. In the specific culture of the syndicate, where intelligence and judgment were the primary currencies of respect, the Apalachin escape, understood correctly, enhanced rather than diminished Meyer Lansky's position. The bosses who had run through the woods knew what his absence meant. They knew he had intelligence they had not had. They knew he had made a decision they had not made. And in a world where the specific failure of intelligence that produced Apalachin was being analyzed and learned from, the person who had demonstrated that his intelligence was better than everyone else's was the person whose counsel was most worth having. The specific relationships between Meyer Lansky and the major syndicate bosses in the period after Apalachin are not well documented in the public record. But the general pattern of the period is documented well enough to see that his operational role in the syndicate's financial architecture continued without interruption. The financial management of the casino operations, the offshore architecture, the management of the territorial reshuffling that followed the Anastasia killing, all of this continued. Meyer Lansky's involvement in it continued. The Apalachin raid had produced no change in his operational role. The absence that protected him from the legal and political consequences of Apalachin was not the absence of someone who had been excluded from the organization's inner circle. It was the absence of someone who was so central to the organization's inner workings that his operational continuity was more important than his physical presence at any single meeting. He was not at Apalachin. But the work that he did, the financial intelligence that he provided, the management of the architecture that made the syndicate's operations possible, none of that was at Apalachin either. It was wherever Meyer Lansky was, and wherever Meyer Lansky was on November 14, 1957, the most important work of the syndicate continued, undisturbed, while 63 men ran through the woods of upstate New York into the flash bulbs of history. This is the final measure of the Apalachin escape. Not just the absence and its immediate benefit, the continuity. The financial architecture continued running on November 14th, exactly as it had run on November 13th, because its architect was not in the woods. He was somewhere else, doing what he always did, while the world changed around him without changing him. The invisible man, still invisible, at the moment when everyone else became permanently visible.